So thank you again, Hilary, for taking the time to be interviewed for the conference. I wonder if I could just ask you to briefly introduce yourself and the paper, basically.
So my name is Hilary Smith, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Denver in the history department. And I teach Chinese history and the history of medicine and science. And so, in my research, I've always been interested um, in how people with authoritative knowledge about the natural world, including bodies and eating and all of that, how they sort of develop and maintain that authority, and particularly in the context of China. And so my first book was a history of one particular disease concept called jiaoqi, which gets translated in the modern period as a nutritional deficiency disease. And what I found when I was writing that book is that if you look at sources before the 20th century, it's not clear that that is a nutritional deficiency disease. There are all sorts of things that it could be. And so I got very interested in sort of that knowledge transition that happens in the late 19th, early 20th century, that creates things like the concept of a nutritional deficiency disease and vitamins. And so that sort of was the springboard for what I'm working on now, which is a kind of history of nutrition science with China at its center. And so this paper is really part of that broader project. And so in this paper, I'm looking at kind of one piece of that story, but that's how I got interested in doing this kind of modern project.
Fantastic. So this one piece of this, quite frankly, huge project. If you can just
Yes.
describe the sort of central question that drove you as you were putting together this single piece for the conference.
What I was interested in is how and whether newly developing scientific ideas about vitamins interacted with pre-existing ideas in China about healthy eating. Ideas that were in Chinese medical classics, for example, or just kind of folk ideas about what constitutes a healthy diet. And I was interested in this because this period, the Republican period, which is what I focus on in this paper, is exactly the period in which the concept of vitamins is developing in nutritional science. So the term vitamin itself was coined in 1912, so right after the start of the Republican period. And then the decades after that are decades of intense research into vitamins, into trying to understand what these things are, how many of them are there, how much of them do we need, things like that. And so it struck me that, the coincidence of kind of this really important central idea in contemporary nutrition science emerging in a context in which you have just a lot of kind of new ideas developing in China, and a kind of synthesis of Western ideas, of scientific ideas, of classical ideas, of Buddhist and Taoist ideas coming together. What would that look like in terms of healthy eating? And so I wanted to really focus on that question. So that was sort of what got me interested in doing this project.
Fascinating. I mean, it seems to me the way you approach it, your historical sources, your selection of historical sources must have been crucial for this. And so you've taken newly launched at that time journals, Chinese medical journals, as well as looking at the classical texts and how practitioners would have used those. How did you did the query kind of guide you towards the selection of your sources, or was it the other way around? How did you figure out how to put your sources together for this paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to begin with, I really used a strategy that I had used for my book earlier, which was to follow the kind of key terms, right? For my book, I was kind of following jiaoqi through time from the 4th century AD until the 20th century. And for this project, I was looking in these newly published journals for the terms that meant vitamin. And there's a whole, as you would expect, initially, there's just a real variety of things that they come up with, to try to capture either the meaning of vitamin in Western languages, or to just kind of transliterate it. And so there's, sort of what we have now is Wei Shang Su. And that was created then. But then there are all these other sort of variants that are like, so Wei Shang Su is sort of the protective element, right? Protecting the element that protects your life. But then there are all of these other things like Huo Li Su, the sort of vivacity element, right? And there are all these other ways of sort of referring to vitamins that appear in the literature. And so basically I kind of canvassed that literature to try to figure out what are all of the different terms that are used to mean vitamin here, and where can I find them? And then what are they saying about it, right? But then on the other hand, you also have lots of journals of Chinese medicine at this time in the Republican period. And for the most part, they are not talking about any of these scientific terms meaning vitamin. And so there I was looking for these terms that meant sort of products that enhance your life or extend your life in some way, like bupin, right? And so I was looking for a different kind of set of terms there. What this, I think, search strategy highlights is one of the findings actually of the paper, which is kind of that there really isn't actually a lot of communication between these two camps, between the nutrition scientists and the Chinese medicine folks. As much as I would have liked there to have been, it seems like they were speaking in different languages, and not only that, but their whole understanding of what constitutes a healthy diet was very different, where in the scientific literature, it was very much about meeting a minimum, sort of making sure you get enough of these Wei Shang Su or Huo Li Su, in order to not have a deficit, right? And so it was very much obsessively concerned about kind of deficiencies and deficits. Whereas in the Chinese medicine literature, they really weren't concerned about that very much at all. What they were concerned about was kind of less the content of the diet, the sort of what are you eating, than the context of what you're eating. The how are you eating? Are you eating in a spirit of sort of relaxation and cheerfulness, right? Are you eating only until you're about 80 or 90% full? Things like that. And they seem to care much less about, are you getting vitamins A, B, C, and D, right? Are you getting all of these specific elements that you need for the healthy diet? And so in some ways that was kind of disappointing to me, because my question wanted to see the synthesis of these two. And in fact, there didn't seem to be much synthesis, but by looking at them, kind of juxtaposing them, it produced a very interesting kind of image of two very different ways of understanding healthy eating that were both modern, but quite different. And I think have been synthesized more recently. So not in the Republican period necessarily, but more recently they're kind of coming together.
You touch upon that towards the end of your paper when you talk about how a particular author, I won't give it away, ended up sort of coming full circle round to kind of, describe again his own discipline area in these kinds of maybe more classical terms. Did you find that was the most interesting finding, or the kind of most interesting thing that came out of your particular research for this particular slice of your research? The fact that, or was it, what you said earlier about the fact that traditional, sort of older ideas of Chinese dietetics was really about restraint or kind of control, I guess, or more of in a sort of reflective of abundance rather than malnutrition, even though the reality was probably very complicated. What kind of thing really struck you from doing this research?
I think one of the things that really struck me here, that it doesn't end up being sort of one of the main points or arguments of the paper, but really just incidentally stood out to me, was despite all of this attention that nutrition scientists were paying to vitamins and vitamin deficiencies, and they're just doing study after study of Chinese food, of sort of the chemical components of various Chinese foods, and surveys of diets in particular contexts, trying to find evidence of vitamin deficiencies or malnutrition. And despite this kind of assumption that it was there, it really struck me that they didn't find much, right? And that they spend a lot of time trying to explain why Chinese people really are malnourished, even though their studies aren't showing that. And that really kind of stood out to me and surprised me, that, even those nutrition scientists who are really looking hard for this end up conceding, things like an evaluation of the adequacy of vitamins in the Chinese diet is rather difficult, right? And saying things like, we have some hints that this might be a problem, but they're based on animal experiments and what one of these scientists called paper analyses. They're not actually observing, lots of vitamin deficits in the Chinese population at large, right? And so that really kind of stood out to me. And that's not to say that there weren't nutritional deficits and problems in certain populations in China in the Republican period, but they tended to be in populations with really very controlled or constrained diets, prisoners or hospital patients or boarding school students, where really somebody is planning the diet, in a central location and kind of parceling it out to people, and it turns out to be inadequate, right? But for people who really had the ability to choose what they were eating, even people of not very much means, it seems like this wasn't, malnutrition or clinical vitamin deficits really weren't a huge problem, as far as I can tell from the primary sources. So that really did kind of surprise me and stand out to me.
I found it absolutely fascinating, that point that you raised, amazing. And you also mentioned the fact that this was during conflict, this was during the, aggression from Japan and obviously the Civil War. So how much do you think the war context or the context of conflict played into this idea, this politicization of, I guess, malnutrition or trying to find it, I guess, and to kind of explain away maybe loss of territory? Well, I'm putting more ideas into this, but was the context king in this situation?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. And that's an interesting idea that you just raised, that it's a sort of way of explaining away the loss of territory. I hadn't thought of it that way. But I do think that what happens in the late 1930s, 1940s, when you have huge displacement of the population with the Japanese invasion, is that sort of vindicates or validates these nutrition scientists in their belief that really the most important thing to study is deficits and deficiencies, and that's a huge problem in China, because in that context it is, right? Supply chains are being broken. You have refugee populations that need to be fed, right? And so in those sort of exigent circumstances, yes, absolutely, malnutrition was a huge problem. But these nutrition scientists believed that since the 1920s, right? And so it's sort of what happens in the 1940s in that emergency situation kind of elevates their pre-existing belief about the deficiency of the Chinese diet to become, kind of accepted as the central fact about China and the Chinese diet. And I think you see that moving forward in Chinese nutrition science, that it really becomes much more concerned about deficiency and deficit, and that becomes very much part of a kind of elite common understanding of Chinese diet, including into the communist period. So I think that has just a huge influence in solidifying those ideas and kind of elevating them.
So then maybe drawing out a little bit from your paper and looking at the kind of ideas that you interrogate in the wider field. You mentioned Sean Xianglin Lei and Briddy Andrews as the kind of, the people that you're talking against, I guess, or talking with. Could you just draw a little bit about on how you interacted with their ideas, or how your paper builds on theirs or complicates their notions a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So Briddy Andrews and Sean Xianglin Lei have both written these groundbreaking works about Chinese medicine in the Republican period, and they really sort of, for me, changed the way that I thought about Chinese and Western medicine in the modern period, in the sense that what they're showing, one of the things that they're showing is that this is not a context in which two kind of fully formed medical traditions, clashed and came into conflict and, sort of interacted with one another, but rather it's a much more complicated situation in which both Western medicine and Chinese medicine are kind of in formation in this period. The ideas of these two kinds of medicine, the idea that they are two kinds of medicine, right? Those are all ideas that are kind of developing in this context, and that they kind of grow in tandem and become foils of one another in the modern period. And so I have kind of applied that to thinking about eating, and rather than thinking about nutritional ideas as sort of, you have the scientific ideas that come into China and they're fully formed and fully developed, and then you have these classical ideas that they interact with and compete with or collide with. I do think it's really more of a process of all of these ideas kind of forming together, right, in the same context, and I think that there is a way in which that special context in Republican China makes nutrition science a little bit different. It makes it have a little bit of a different place in society. It's nutrition science gets inflected, I think, through a different set of kind of cultural assumptions in Republican China. And so I'm kind of taking that insight about Chinese medicine and then applying it in this this new field of nutrition science.
And this new field of nutrition science, obviously there's, there are problematics within that, and new ideas. And you mentioned early on in your piece that Casey Chang's work, the treatment of nutritional science at that point in the late 70s, you mentioned the word sanguine, which I love. So obviously since then, nutritional science itself has developed and developed its own problematics. How do you find, looking back on Casey Chang's work and drawing your own paper, are there contrasts within the field that you want to just explicate now, or?
Yeah, I think there are some contrasts. I would say that in the Chang volume, the contributors, by and large, are not really focused on nutrition, right? That's not sort of a main focus. But where they do focus on nutrition, I was actually kind of happily surprised that where they do focus on nutrition, I think they kind of see what I see, which is that it seems like for the most part, malnutrition or nutritional deficiencies were not a kind of inherent timeless feature of Chinese diet, right? They have, as you mentioned, the word sanguine, they have a pretty a pretty sanguine view about the value of Chinese diets, and I agree with that. And the reason I was kind of surprised about that is that I think nutrition scientists, by and large, do not, right, and have not in the modern period. So it was nice to see, the historians and anthropologists kind of having that view. On the other hand, I think what they don't do in that volume is really interrogate the ideas of nutrition science itself. Right, that there's a sort of assumption that what was known about and assumed about good diet from a scientific perspective when they wrote the book was basically right, right, and was true. And I'm sort of questioning that, right? So I'm thinking about, where do our ideas about what the appropriate elements of a diet come from, and I think they do come from this period, actually. And so, if we look a little bit harder at the social and political context of the formation of those contemporary scientific ideas, how does that make us think differently about assessments of the Chinese diet? So I think that's sort of what I'm doing that they weren't quite doing at that time in 1977.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. My last question, again, related to the broader field, is so your panel is about scientific food futures. So you have co-panelist Fan Yang, who talks about robot cookery in Shenzhen and looks at that. You also have Mindy Schneider, who's looking at the sort of super high technology of pig farming and pig rearing in China as well. And it strikes me that your paper is also very much, even though it's looking at a specific period in the past, it's very much about future bodies. Wu Xian himself says, we can't possibly eat enough nutrients for now, but maybe sometime in the future we can, accumulate. So clearly there's always this idea of a future body, a sort of a future nutritional state. Are there any other bits of the future that you think, or is there something that you want to expand on in terms of sort of futurism of your paper?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, and I think you're right that particularly a lot of the nutrition science ideas really are about the future, right? And they're sort of premised on this idea that we can make a better population, we can make a better Chinese body, if we just change these things, if we re-engineer the diet, right? And that very much, I think, resonates with later communist ideas about, the ability of human beings to re-engineer the world, including themselves, right? And so I think it is very much a forward-looking kind of ideology, and that's actually something that I both admire and kind of struggle with in the sources that I've been reading, because in some ways I think there's something really wonderfully aspirational about that, but on the other hand, I also see how in the 1930s, 1940s, it was sort of reinforcing ideas about Chinese inferiority, right, and the superiority of Western bodies and diets and things like that. So I think it's a very complicated and in some ways problematic kind of aspiration for the future.
Thank you so much, Hilary. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Mukta. This has been fun.